Good evening, everybody. It is 5:01 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in beautiful Brooklyn, New York. My name is Max Cohen. It's my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to the MOCA Live podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. We have an awesome show today. Let's just get right to it. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host, as always. That would be the founder of the Museum of Crypto Art and all-around wonderful guy, Coborn Bell, down below me. What's up, Coborn? How are you?
I'm doing so much better than I was last week. Thank you, Max.
Yeah, you were still sick last week, right?
Oh gosh, it took a while to clear out. I did hear some rumors of the dirty C word, COVID, going around. So it's possible that maybe I was one of the victims.
I was not sure what dirty C word you were going to mention,
I
but let's move
know.
right past that. Today, we are welcoming also to the show a guest whose place on the podcast has been, frankly, long overdue and a long time coming. That would be the gentleman to my right, the brilliant cloud artist, high order crypto art historian, all around great guy, Mr. Martin Lucas Osachowski. What's up, Martin? How are you?
Hey, how's it going? So excited to be here.
Yeah, I know. We're, like I said, long overdue to have you on the podcast. We have a lot to get to today. Let's just start getting into it. In thinking about what we wanted to talk about for the podcast today, I wound up in a rabbit hole of kind of your work and specifically around like some of your earliest contributions to crypto art. And we're going to reference it again and again on the show. I'll get into it more later, but you co-authored an academic paper in 2019 called Crypto Art, a Decentralized View. And you've basically been cataloging the history of crypto art since, for a lot of people, there was crypto art. There was some stuff a little bit before then, but you preceded the massive adoption of the market and you were kind of right there in the thick of things when it first began. And, you're among, I think, a few individuals who have really put a lot of your career into like investigating and cataloging as well as just creating crypto art. And I am curious, like, why do you think it's necessary for us in crypto art to have a common, like, verifiable history that we can kind of rally around and understand, as opposed to something that's more kind of like multinodal, different coming from every source?
Yeah, I think, in general, I find there's very little material in this space to educate until today. I still struggle when people ask me like, where do they start? Where do I send them to, right? There has been a few publications, but even like on the academic side, I found just because of the difficulty in, getting this information, they tend to be like fairly shallow. And I think I've seen, some approaches where the history was basically, commercially weaponized. Like people were tweaking the history towards their agendas or objectives. And I thought that, if I'm going to do something like that, it would be interesting to adhere to some sort of like academic standards, right? Basically, if there's no sources for it, then, I appreciate your word for it, but like, this is not the way it would work, right? That gives me also some sort of protection for it. But, in general, I think, I'm very interested in knowledge production, and I think the academic discourse which comes a little bit short. And I think it's an approach which helps us to contextualize it. I think it is sort of our history and our achievements, and I think we should also be in charge of writing it.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, like, this becomes a topic again and again. I've seen it generally when there's like a Christie's or a Sotheby's sale where they say, oh, it's the first this, or this is a pioneer who did this. I know Jedi Wolf, I think, is the collector who put out their opinion of what was a comprehensive list of all the AI artworks that had come out since, I think, 2018, or had been minted from 2018 to now, and like AI artists, their first mints. And there was a lot of flack on that because obviously it couldn't encapsulate everything that's going on here. And I think when you bring into account like influencer politics and the kind of folks that we follow when we first fall down the crypto art rabbit hole, it's hard for me to even comprehend like what qualifies as a crypto art history. I guess a follow-up question is like, do you think there can be a comprehensive crypto art history? I know that things are verified on chain, but it feels to me like history is always written by the victors, but that especially concerns like an art movement where like history is going to swirl around star systems more than perhaps accurate representations of what happened.
Yeah, I think it also has to be seen some sort of like pluralistic, right? I think the more different histories we have, the more interesting it becomes to kind of like distill and make your own opinion, right? I mean, there has been early approaches from what is it called? Rutherford.
Sense?
No, it was
different Rutherford.
No, it was basically the collective in the UK. Now I really forgot the name. Where Rhea Meyer was part of with Kath Rutherford, I think. And that kind of suggested the idea of basically a decentralized history, right? Which should be not written by one. And I think Dada also did some interesting work with their HNHT Fest, trying to kind of consolidate all the different approaches of which histories are out there, and let's create some sort of synthetic or a synthesis of all these different approaches. And I think what is really interesting for me is to see that they basically struggle at the very core questions. It's like, for instance, how do we set the date, right? Like, what defines really the date? Is it the intention? Is it when something goes live? Is it the contract? Is it an announcement? And these are like all questions which I think are unanswered until today. But it's interesting to see, and I think the more we have, the better it is. And I think it's important to also bring that, away from only Twitter feeds and images, but also bring it into academia, where these things are typically kind of preserved. So yeah, I do believe we're gonna it's kind of like an approximation where the more we do, the better it gets. And I'm curious to maybe explore that on the academic side even more for a longer period.
I want to hang on something that you brought up, which I always find fascinating, especially as I like go through artworks and I try and like source them correctly. You come across these artworks that were like created in a different date than they were minted. Like I wrote about Osanachi a couple weeks ago, who had minted a couple works on Solana as editions, and they were created, either minted in 2024, but they were created in 2022 and 2023. And the question becomes like, well, what's the date for our purposes that's more important, right? Like you said, like, is it the minting date? Is it the creation date? Is it the conception date? Colborn, like how did you come to the decision to treat the Genesis collection of the museum as things minted before January 2021? Because I imagine that was not an arbitrary decision.
Yeah. You got to cut it off somewhere, right? And I think we can all kind of agree that was when it started to become, there was a financial invitation broadly to digital artists to begin to participate. And as we are a museum of crypto art, there has to be some kind of perhaps consideration as to what delineates that, and for us that was more of the like feet on the ground philosophical legwork in which somebody was participating in the movement via their art. Now this is I was going back and I was looking at our collection and came across a piece by Hex6C who likened crypto art to pop art, and how the money was always intertwined with the artwork, and we were always aware of it, but obviously post people that accelerated in a way I think none of us could have ever expected.
For sure. I think that's a really prescient point, and that also comes up in this crypto art decentralized view paper, Mark, that you co-authored in 2019. But one of the things that I think is difficult for me as a purveyor of crypto art's narrative to communicate to people is the sense that crypto art, even from its earliest inception, was not really an aesthetic movement. We can liken, I think that this pop art analogy is really prescient, but it's also somewhat limited, right? It's pop arty in its like fundamental kind of like economic backbone, but not in its aesthetics at all. You can't put anything of crypto art in a box. I think we've tried time and time again, and as a movement, to establish like an aesthetic definition of crypto art, and we've failed. And I think that that's really what I want to talk about today, is like these alternative definitions of crypto art. But I want to just stop briefly. And Colborn, I know I'm going to put you on the spot here asking this, but like what kind of artwork, or what artwork specifically, would you like show a layperson who wants to see and like get crypto art?
Well, I mean, I think it begins with the idea of how do you own and authenticate digital art, period, right? And in that idea of ownership is the concept that it can be traded and replicated. I think IPFS as a decentralized storage mechanism, ensuring like longevity is important. And, you know, these are kind of new emergent systems that arose with the rise of Ethereum, the idea that there could be a trustless smart contract. So, you know, what artwork do I point people to when I try and begin to explain crypto art? I don't have an answer to that.
I knew it was a hard one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't.
Maybe Martin does.
Martin.
I always avoided NFTs when I talk about crypto art, because I found that, you know, everybody since 2021 has an idea of an NFT. So I always try to go back and I like the example of Mediengruppe Beatnik, which was like a collective which created the Random Darknet Shopper. The Random Darknet Shopper was basically a conceptual artwork, a smart contract bot, if you want, which was buying by itself for $100 worth of Bitcoin, random things in the darknet and sending it to a museum. And that is an artwork which, you know, has frequented museums since 2014 and is still in museums. And I think that is, for me, a great example, you know, how you can work with this technology in a very meaningful, interesting way, without any tokenized outcome. And that is usually what I try to see, because it just expands your definition what crypto art is, right? Because we always limit it to like a file, but it can be so much more.
I mean, go just off of that, go to Ray Myers and, you know, the is art, this token is art, very, very fundamental conceptual understanding of that, you know, the token itself. We had this debate for so long. Is it like the token or is it the file attached? We've had this debate with Xcopy because we've lost the file attached. And I think that is a really good way for people to understand that, you know, that inscription, that moment, that idea of intention, signing the transaction, analogous to signing the signature, is the moment of conception and creation, and that token itself is the art.
Yeah, and I'll expand on that, like talking about just like early artists, right? Like Sarah Miyohas. We have a Bitcoin in the Genesis collection, and Bitcoin, as far as I understand it, was like basically an experiment in like, if we catalog and then digitize and then tokenize a physical object, and the physical object is degradable, it's a flower petal, like, well, what's the art object? Again, is it the physical object that was the art? Is it the digitization of the physical object? Is it the token of the digitized file of the physical object? And the definition becomes harder and harder to.
Let's counterpoint that a bit with kind of the Damien Hirst currency series, which was very similar conceptually. He said the work was created in 2018. It recently came out that a lot of the work was created by, you know, aides in his studio many years later. And in my mind, that's not the art. And we've seen kind of a wave of it also with AI art, the market coming back, people saying, oh, this work was generated in 2018, but it wasn't tokenized until, you know, 2013, 2014. And, you know, what does that really mean?
Good question. Was that rhetorical, or do you want me to answer?
No, I mean, you know, we're talking about the value of crypto arts. You know, if somebody generates in a vacuum and it lives on a hard drive 5 years later, does it make it relevant to the history of the development? Or is the act of saying that this is an artwork and I'm signing it in this way and I'm creating this token around it to signify and cement it on a decentralized ledger, for me, that's far more important than when the work was actually generated, because there's almost a recognition that what you're doing needs to be preserved, needs to be authenticated, needs to have that provenance and that legacy with that timestamp.
Well, yeah, I mean, within that article, the crypto art, a decentralized, sorry, I'm forgetting the name, crypto art, a decentralized view. Thank you. Within that, they talk about Duchamp getting a piece notarized by a notary, and then that basically like authenticating the artwork instead of like the provenance. It was the notarization. Sorry, notarization. Thank you very much. I've never been to a notary. The notarization of the artwork that is like valuable for like authentication purposes. And obviously the Damien Hirst, I think, is a really good example, because it's like, how do we trust that this piece was created in 2018 if we don't have hash marks, if we don't have, you know, blockchain validation? But this all kind of brings me to the point, which is defining crypto art as something technical or aesthetic is basically impossible because of preconceived notions from the public, and because of just aesthetic diversity. And Martin, I'm curious, like, you have, as far as I know, started moving away from defining crypto art as something technical or aesthetic to something value-based. And I'm curious when that happened and what kind of clued you into that as perhaps a through line to understanding crypto art.
Well, I guess it came with the dialogue in general in the space, right? I think initially what motivated me with the technical description is that it was just like a massive misunderstanding of what crypto art is. People were so focused on NFTs, you know, mixing it with fungible tokens, ignoring basically contractual work or conceptual work, that I was focused on like, okay, let's widen up our definition model so that we can just capture all these amazing artworks and artists which have been working for years in this space, right? And I think as the dialogue shifted, you know, people kind of were recognizing the future. You could see that there was no common denominator in the values anymore, which for me was always like a good way of describing crypto art, right? Like people were aligned in some sort of like value model or value definitions that they would gather around and form a community, you know, from a very abstract view, kind of like a virtual community, you know, moving away from this idea of nation states. But here we were, and you know, the 69 million sale was for me definitely something which created the necessity to explore that on more on that level. Having worked now for 4 years, you know, on the history, I started last year really working in depth on the value side of things, right? And I think similar to the history, which was like a very research-centric element, I'm working right now on an equally research-centric element around the values, right? Where I interview, in my objective, several hundred crypto artists to basically explore, you know, their definitions, their values, and kind of create some sort of common ground of where we are, and maybe also see what and when things have shifted, in which direction. So that's a project which I've been working on. I have not intentionally published a lot yet, because I kind of, as I'm still doing these interviews, I do not want to kind of like, you know, prime people too much on the direction I'm going. And I still believe I'm probably a year or two away until finishing the scope and kind of set myself to get some sort of representative results. But it's definitely something, you know, which seems to become more and more important as we see, you know, there's a big fragmentation in the space. You know, the cohesiveness is gone. There's like people flocking in all sort of different directions where we can also not pinpoint them to like a place to kind of find what is important to us. And I think that's where my focus started to shift towards, okay, we need to kind of anchor newcomers or participants some sort of, and giving them something to kind of understand where we are coming from and with we, you know, I would say like people who are in the space a bit longer than others.
Well, there's an interesting.
I've thought of a bunch of other works. I think CryptoPunks is probably a wonderful place to begin to send people to understand. I think the First Supper, the async piece, it wouldn't be a MOCA podcast if we didn't mention that. And then, you know, Saint Nakamoto, A Lot of Money, Da Vinci. I think that maybe more visually or aesthetically can encapsulate crypto art.
I appreciate the in real time research, my friend.
Well, since we're catching up, I also remember Furtherfield and Ruth Cathlo, which was basically the framework where they started working on a decentralized timeline.
So let's keep on with like this timeline thing, and I want to stick on values further. You know, we have spoken on this podcast. We spent a whole episode talking about a Cypherpunks manifesto, which was Eric Hughes's document from 1983, talking about privacy and choice, and laid a lot of the foundation for what like the blockchain would be. The Cypherpunks, Eric Hughes, Ted Haynes, I think his name is. Did I get that right?
Sounds right.
Yeah. Ted Haynes. So anyways, the reason I bring that up is because you basically have like these values entrenched in the early 90s or the early to mid 90s, and then you kind of see them like remain in their little bubble. Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they may be, kind of resurrects them in 2008 with Bitcoin, and then that ethos kind of carries over, still pretty like point by point by point, pretty straight line arrow until like 2021, at which point everything kind of changes. You mentioned the Beeple sale, at which point like a lot of these values that were basically fundamental to the slow growth of this movement over 20 plus years kind of like eroded like that. And there was a lot more in the way of willing and voluntary degradation of those values for the purpose of the market. What does it say to you, if anything, that after so long, I mean, longer by magnitudes of 3 or 4 than crypto art has probably existed, even at its longest definition, that within such a short time, those pretty clear defined values kind of began to erode, and then probably did erode, I think, in a lot of people's opinions, like that.
I think, people just don't know what the cypherpunks are or who the cypherpunks are. I mean, even Google, if you do like more specific things about cypherpunks, they will guide you to cyberpunk. Suddenly we go from a value-oriented movement to like a movement which derived in literature, and I think, I don't know to which extent you already have worked up the cypherpunks in a nutshell or not, but I think it's just so important to know where it comes from and in which kind of nurturing ground Bitcoin fell. For me it was always it came with time, because I found that the 69 million sale was always like this huge accelerator where nobody had time anymore. While people before that, they actually had to go through some sort of research. They had to, they wanted to take the time, they wanted to understand, and because money was not the primary motivation for it, right? There was other aspects like freedom, inclusion, self-sovereignty. There were other values which were interested and sought after, and and I think this is where the dangerous lies, right? I mean, for me, the cypherpunks, one of the core idea was the privacy of the weak, right? Like the protection of the weak, and then the radical transparency of the powerful. And I think this principle is forgotten, that we kind of flock again towards the powerful, and we give up all of our, privacy, all of our protection, because we don't think enough about it. We don't have the time to think about it because we're chasing short-term, objectives, while we don't think about, this whole thing long-term. This is something which always fascinated me because, as an artist, like I intend for a lifelong practice, right? Like, so what's the rush? Like, why, like, nobody who is like seriously involved in artistic practice aims to cash out and then live on an island, right? What are they going to do? Like, why do we have to not take the time and understand what we're participating in.
Mm.
And I think, as we are developing towards like technologically enabled surveillance states, I think the overall idea is that, all the states are starting to look the same. I think it was James Carey or something who said it, that, that in this technology-driven society, we're all striving for like power, wealth, productivity. We work towards like technical perfectionism, but ethical nihilism. And I think that really captures it for me. So, the cypherpunks really distrusted this whole idea, right? They distrusted centralized governments, and they didn't only oppose the governments, but also they extended that to large corporations, right? Because what are large corporations? They're like not democratically accountable for, right? They're basically just some sort of like elites or whatever, right? Who make decision making, and they're basically, there's no checks and balance on them, right? And I think cypherpunks recognized that, and they thought that cryptography, in the first place, is a way of evolve to truly anonymous systems where people tend to make free choices and are not coerced into decision making. And I think this is in their way the best way to utilize decentralized knowledge in a society.
And I think we should definitely tie in some of the Occupy Wall Street sentiments, kind of a populist movement around what was happening in finance, like large institutional breaking of distrust, and kind of the rise of the tech giants as we know it, in which we were very willing to trade away our personal data, our private data, to these centralized entities. And it felt at its core like an attempt to try and pull some power back. And I think between Occupy Wall Street and I think, this movement, we will continue to like leverage technology personally for self-sovereignty. Perhaps, and perhaps we'll just continue to fail, but they're valiant attempts, I guess.
Does the ability, Colborne, of an institution like BlackRock purchasing a large enough share of Bitcoin to change the architecture of the movement around it preclude Bitcoin from being any longer a weapon for freedom, transparency, self-sovereignty?
Oh, what a question. I mean, it's there. There's something like five corporations, BlackRock included, that own like 80% of the stock market and all of the system. And really the only way to participate in any of this game is to participate alongside them.
I think what I would add is just that, from a cypherpunk perspective, Bitcoin wasn't even decentralized enough. Bitcoin did not offer enough privacy. It was the best tool at hand by none, and still is, but it didn't even go far enough for the cypherpunks as a model of really effectively allow privacy and being out of reach of like institutions and governments and surveillance.
It's interesting to see how these things like trickle down into crypto art, because I have felt and feel more and more that crypto art is kind of like an unwitting representation of a lot of these larger forces that are swept up in it, whether that's just cryptocurrency finance or just finance in general. But like, one of the big points of the Cypherpunk Manifesto, which I will probably bungle as I try and recite it, is like, privacy is the choice to selectively reveal oneself, like as one wishes. And it's interesting to see how that like manifested in crypto art at the beginning, right? Like the transactions are public, but like the owners of the transactions aren't public, right? You can be anonymous. You can hide yourself behind layers of like identity and data. And it's interesting for me to see how that has been changed depending on one's level of power within crypto art today, right? If you have a substantial amount of power or influence or reach, like an X copy, you are given more leave to not reveal yourself to the world. Whereas I think, Colborne, we touched on this last week with Robness, like a lot of these collectors providing quote unquote advice to artists about like, well, reveal your process and get to know collectors and like put more of yourself into the art. Like if you're coming into crypto art from a less powerful position, you do not have nearly as much freedom to selectively reveal yourself to the community, to the world. People want to see your name on things. People want to see when you minted a work. People want to see your identity. They want to hear your thoughts. They want to have a relationship to you. And it feels like that specific value continues to be eroded, but probably in a way we would have all feared and assumed would happen, which is like the powerful and influential would retain that ability, whereas the less powerful and influential would be subjugated to less personal choice over their information.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything to
more to say on that. It's kind of a hard truth. It's kind of a hard truth.
Yeah.
Those with the means have the ability to make the decisions that involve their freedom. You know, freedom in this world is generally a factor of money.
So this podcast is way too not way too often. It is necessarily often a kind of like, damn, this doesn't feel good at all kind of exercise. And I actually don't think that that's what I feel is necessary in this conversation. We've talked time and time again about the erosion of crypto art values, but MLO, you have said, I believe you shared this at the NFC Summit, if I'm not mistaken, is that the Web3 renaissance is yet to come. And I was hoping you could just summarize that point or your points for us. If it relates to this topic, great. If not, you know.
Sure. So basically where I come from is what was the Renaissance about, right? The Renaissance was about where like a very clear defined power structure, which was like the church and nobility. And we had, you know, a shift. So we planted the seeds for the idea of dispersion of power. We had the transition from, you know, collectivism towards like individualism, towards humanism. And when I looked at the crypto space, I felt like we are coming from the same, you know, embedding it in the influence of the cypherpunks. You know, it was all about like empowerment and basically the dispersion of power, right? And specifically for art, it was for me, you know, here we have like this institutional power structure. We have, you know, tiered gallery systems, and we have like social media monopolies, right? And crypto is offering us.
Sorry, that was like the most chaotic.
So we got some drama going on over here. Sorry.
Apologies.
Oh, good. So crypto was in that sense, you know, very similar. And it started like as a grassroots movement where like people were aligned, right? They wanted to empower the artists. They wanted to democratize the art world. And, you know, these early marketplaces collaborated in order how to achieve that. And, you know, fast forward, you know, or before we fast forward, that was the time where we celebrated it as the Web3 Renaissance, right? Like there were exhibitions, there were papers written. It was celebrated as like, okay, we're living the Web3 Renaissance. And now I fast forward, you know, like 3-4 years. And here we are in an environment, you know, where we have venture capital-led consolidation, where we have like the rise of influencers, where we have, you know, a lot of private blockchains, corporate chains, which people are flocking to, which, you know, which is for me like some sort of reversal of this movement. So I'm asking myself, like, if we are moving towards like, again, a more centralized direction, we haven't achieved the Web3 Renaissance. We're celebrating ourselves, but we have yet to arrive there. You know what I mean?
I will say I've always posited that I consider all of it a bit of a Trojan horse to just facilitate cryptocurrency adoption, right? And the broader we can expand the movement to make it less technical and accessible to people to begin to understand that digital things in general, be it money, be it art, be it whatever it is, have value, is inherently important in facilitating both an economic shift, but more importantly, like a consciousness shift in how we arrive at perhaps like a more sustainable, renewable society that continues to separate the power of money and distribution of money with the power of state.
I think that's a very good point. And when I think about it, I always have like two thoughts which come directly into my mind. The one is kind of looking at the perspective from like informational networks, right? You have like these huge tech giants like Google, like Meta, right, where they constantly overreach privacy, they accumulate excessive amount of data, and yet they're they're tolerated by the government because they collaborate with it, acting to some extent as an extended government agent. And then you look at transactional networks, and for me, the two biggest disturbing points were like both happening around 2012. We had, on the one hand, coming from the prime crisis, we had several European central banks imposing negative interest rates. And that is, for me, we're not talking about like global South fighting inflation. We're talking about like Europe basically, having taxed income, and the bank says like, we don't want you to accumulate wealth. We need you to spend and lend. And if you don't, we're going to take 0.5% of you every month. This is for me like a big precursor or herald of what central bank issued currencies will bring. From expiry dates on currencies, from government approved vendors list. It's just mind-boggling what will be possible, right? So if you look at that, and then the second point for me was always like the WikiLeaks controversy, right? You had like WikiLeaks was revealing basically all these drone attacks and whatever. And basically, the U.S. government was kind of limiting the donations, right? They put pressure on the SWIFT system, which they control, large technical infrastructure. They were forcing basically big credit card banks and corporations like PayPal to not basically be able to fund them. So you see that, also in transactional networks, basically governments tend to overreach and, act disturbingly. So if it doesn't work on these informational networks and it happens on these transactional networks, it's like, how can we even consider what's happening right now with all these private chains? That is, for me, the most disturbing thing, is like, if you have private chains, and I know exactly I didn't want to go there, but now I'm here. Like, how can culture live on private chains? Because you are basically creating an environment where these chains become, again, like extended agents of governments. So how would I consider tokenizing art on something like Solana or something like Base, where these are like corporate chains? Like, there is good use cases for these chains, but these are not cultural use cases for me. Culture needs to be separate from, culture needs this immutability. Culture needs this decentralization aspect that the history cannot be rewritten. And I think that is where I see some of the shortcomings, where the values are eroding, because we do not focus enough on this decentralization aspect from it.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible point. I mean, culture that fears its own like limitation in the future can't grow in the direction that it would naturally grow. I agree with you. My love of Solana notwithstanding.
Yeah, I mean, I might push back there a little bit, because I think artists and creators got sold a false promise around royalties, and I think I think there needs to be kind of like a consensus of what are the rules for creators, and being able to kind of honor that without changing the rules post is something that is kind of inherent and in the core, albeit that is a social contract. It's obviously something we're struggling to deal with and solve.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that's ever been the case for any art movement where there was like a dedicated set of rules that were like easily understandable or were fair in general. I think there's a reason that like historically art movements respond to one another with like fury. They were, gosh, I wish I could pull more art history out of my ass, but I know.
Also say, I think artists continue to be victim of a lot of bait and switch, right? And who knows what Facebook, Instagram, all of these places were promising in the beginning. Maybe it's just the ability to waste your free time or share these things, and that's appealing enough, and nobody ever reads the fine print. But I was definitely hurt by a bit of what felt like a bait and switch for the creators that were entering the space.
Yeah,
It
for
felt,
sure.
that we were talking initially about the commodification of art, while it felt like the artist itself becomes the commodity. Like artists were preyed upon, were used like for some sort of validation or legitimization of things, and I think this is where I'm with you on one page on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes back to what you were saying before, MLO, where like, you can't trust like a private chain in general for creatives, because if someone can control the flow of water when they want to shut the water off, they can. I think nobody realized that the royalty thing was like a faucet that could be shut off. But it's very clear that if you take, just use your examples, a Solana or a base, when it stops being economically viable for there to be free minting of things, that is like not free in terms of price, but just freely minted things, or certain content that can or cannot be minted, when those things are no longer economically optimized or just not economically interested, then the flow can be shut off. And I don't know if it's better that like you go into the ecosystem being aware of that to begin with. I agree with you, Colborn, 100% that like, that was like the thing for me, that when I first got into crypto art, I would tell everyone, I'm like, it's amazing that an artist who creates a work in 2018 and it sells for $10 can then become a giant superstar 6 years later and receive like fair compensation for their own fame and growth. Like that was the key completely for why this was such a revolutionary movement. In absence of that, and of course it came in absence of that, because just for a moment, because of one decision by one, I'm going to call, Blur a bad actor, because I think fuck them, but like that one decision changed the entire paradigm. It was no longer economically viable. I didn't realize that those kind of things were not enforceable on chain, just like that it was based on marketplaces. But this, I think, leads into a point that I want to explore towards the end of our podcast, which is that crypto art, because it's related to crypto, because it's related to finance, so many of the things we've been talking about, like, it's hard to understand from a narrative perspective, and it's skewable from a narrative perspective. And I think about every art movement of the past, and the people who have been able to tell the story of those art movements are critics, are academics, are the artists themselves, people who are good at storytelling. But if we know that the story of Ethereum royalties, for instance, like that the artists were fed a story about royalties being enforceable on an actual contractual data level, they were never, and they aren't. And so we're in this position where the people who are best equipped to study and analyze crypto art history are statistical and data analysts more than historians, more than narrative drivers. There's a million people who are making content and very few people who can analyze blockchain, I don't know, data, protocols, etc., and actually understand what's happening there, what's permittable, what's impermissible. I'm curious, like, this is just such a massive paradigm shift, right? Because storytelling is how all of these things have always been created, postured, and then advanced. And now the subtext of this whole conversation is that the story is not enough. What we need is validation. We need like the ability to skim through data and understand when things happened, what the reality of transactions were, what the reality of protocols are. Like, I mean, MLO, I'll throw the question to you, but like, what do you think, and maybe we've already answered this question, but like, what do you think we're missing with this, what feels to me like an overall lack of data analysis or capable data analysis?
I think we see there's an overarching trend across society which kind of sees these things no longer separate. Since I'm looking right now a lot into the academic side of things, I think the transition from separating data science or computer science with humanities, we're shifting towards digital humanities. We see that, there is benefit into not seeing things in separate boxes anymore. And I think we are discovering, that we have so much more access to information, metadata, that we recognize there is a need to kind of work also outside of the usual tool sets.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll throw that question to you, Colburn. Like, what do you think we're missing with the lack of these tool sets? The lack of widely available tool sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need higher power GPUs. You know, I think I think we just need more GPU clusters able to answer our questions. So, you know, these are large language models that we ask to go back and analyze. You know, who did this? Who did this? Look at this guy. This is ridiculous. That's you know, processing power will, at least before it condemns us all, will, you know, solve some of these questions.
Well, I mean, I think that AI is actually a fairly good place to kind of like conclude this podcast. You know, just the other day I needed to do some kind of like very simple data analysis, in the sense that like I needed numbers to be distributed on a normal curve, which is not something that I am capable of because I have no mathematical skills whatsoever. But I had the idea and I had the data, right? And so I could feed it into an AI algorithm and it could then bridge the skill gap, right?
Mm.
The possibility of, if we have this data and we know what questions we're asking, then there is now essentially there will be widely available programs that are then going to bridge the skill gap. You know, I could write Python code. I mean, I can't write Python code. I probably couldn't even in this example, but in theory, I could write Python code for a program that I want to see created using one of these AI engines, even though I don't know how to code whatsoever, just based on like asking the right questions and understanding the flow of information clearly. Yeah. Like, do you think that changes things?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to see into qualitative data analysis, you know, because I think quantitative data analysis is fairly simple, you know, like we can upload an Excel file and it will all analyze it the way we want. But I think if we go in the direction of qualitative information, you know, will we require for some time some sort of like, you know, grounding understanding, grounding base, grounding interpretation, which has to be rooted some sort of in humanity.
Sure. I mean, naturally, right? If the ability to pull information from data is 100% accessible, then the skill that you're teaching is not the ability to read data for information. It's the ability to know what data you need to be pulling. It's the ability to like form trains of logic with data, which is much more a humanities-based idea of analyses. It's much more qualitative than quantitative. You leave that to an outside actor and you kind of just pull the strings. That feels to me like a huge paradigm shift. If the three of us in this conversation could, I don't know, in 2 or 3 years, want any answer about what was first, like data points, you know, imagine having an AI in 2018 that when this royalties thing was, you know, becoming a selling point for crypto art, if an autonomous actor could be prompted and tell everyone, like, actually on a chain level, this thing isn't verifiable. It's only in the marketplaces. And if everything is purchasable on every marketplace, if a marketplace is really just an indexer, then any marketplace or any indexer, like, anyways, I can't land the plane, but you get my point.
Yeah, just to add to that, like, what is it? Since 2013, 40% of the internet has disappeared, right? It kind of comes down to decentralized storage, right? So if it's on chain, it's distributed, it's verifiable, and that is a solid data point. And that's when I kind of go back to like the token is the art. The thing that is there is what matters because it signals the intent. The matching of like digital identity to provable self, right? And the signing of that transaction is really at the fundamental core, the strongest, I think, long-term data point that we have to ensure that something actually happened.
Well, I mean, I have to even push back on that a little bit, and I might be like technologically illiterate here, but like that's the whole conceit of like Art Gnome's Club NFT project, is that like how much of this is actually immutably backed up? How much of this stuff which we trade in a decentralized manner, believing it to be on chain, is not actually so? You know, we're essentially like, unless you are incredibly technologically literate and you're able to like read Etherscan transactions and I don't know, follow those to their source, how can you trust somebody who says, yeah, this is on chain? Well, what does it mean to be on chain? On which chain? for how long? Like, how reliably is the metadata on chain, or is it just like, pulling from a server somewhere? Like, all of these questions are, for me, with my technological competence or lack thereof, essentially unanswerable. And I'm taking people at their word. And if we're going to have something that's like truly decentralized, truly permissionless, truly trustable, then we shouldn't have to take anyone at their word. It shouldn't be a matter of that.
I think we also, like, and I'm curious about your opinion, but I think, the idea of timestamping is not, for me, universal replacing every other form of previous timestamping, right? I mean, there has been like publication, there has been newspapers and other points which have a valid place, I think, in time, in contextualizing intent, in creating context and creating some sort of ledger of events and actions that rejecting everything which is not kind of like, I see it more complementary, if you want to. Does it gain on importance? Absolutely. Is it the only universal truth? I think it does not replace everything else yet.
I mean, we went from encyclopedias to Wikipedia to the idea that like knowledge can be localized, and maybe something like Reddit, right? It's the idea that there are these forums where anybody can come in and speak. This is forever just like a human challenge to leave like legacy and impact and something that lasts and stand. I think that's kind of the whole point of art in general. Is to leave behind that object that symbolizes, captures, represents, and speaks for something bigger than the self.
Well, if the Colossus of Rhodes could fall, then we're in that category. We're probably all fucked. Let's. I feel like we could go forever on this topic.
I know this went by so fast.
And as always,
oh, wow,
when we set off, I know. As always, when we set off to do something like define the values of crypto art, we come to absolutely no conclusion. We go in 150 different directions, which I think is probably more representative of the thing than it seems on its face. But MLO, I want to give you a chance to just tell everyone listening or watching what you have going on and where they can find you and what they should know. So I'd like to just give you the floor, if you like.
Sure. So I guess most of my stuff you can find on mlo.art. There's a section mlo.art/research where I try to publish a lot of things. Other than that, I'm still working on surveying artists from all kind of different point of views with a very open mind. So if I hit you up, I would be happy if you participate.
If you get that call from MLO, don't let it go unanswered. Well, MLO Colborn, thank you very much for being with me today. This was a wonderful conversation. Thanks everyone listening or watching for being with us. If you did like what you saw or heard, you can like, subscribe, or follow this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. We would like you to do so up front. We would also love if you gave us a follow on Substack. I personally would very much like if you gave us a follow on Substack at museumofcrypto.substack.com. Otherwise, I'm Max. Below me is Colborn. Martin Lucas Ostachowski was our guest to my right, and we thank you very much for being with us for what I thought was an incredibly fun podcast. So everybody take care, and we'll be back